If we don't place you in a job and we don't give you a grant, we're going to guarantee for 5 years your salary at the median point for your major after graduation. So if you become a teacher and the starting salary for teachers in let's say you're in Texas is $40,000, we're going to guarantee that over those first 5 years you make $200,000. And if you don't, we're going to pay the difference.
Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Gabriel Jaja, producer. You just heard Dr. Pano Kanelos, president of the new University of Austin in Texas, speaking on the importance of intellectual openness and dialogue that is free from leftist ideology on college campuses. Today on Acton Line, Dylan Paumann interviews Kanelos to dig deeper than the social media hot takes to discover the truth of what the University of Austin in Texas is really all about. You can find additional resources in the show notes of this episode, as well as previous episodes on our website at acton.org/podcast. If you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Acton Line. My name is Dylan Paumann, and I'm a research fellow here at the Acton Institute and executive editor of our Journal of Markets and Morality. I'm joined today by Dr. Pano Kanelos, president of the newly founded University of Austin. Dr. Kanelos, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here and a great pleasure to hear somebody actually pronounce my name exactly the way I pronounce it. That's rare. Thank you.
I go to a Greek church, so I have practice. To get right into it, after your November 8 announcement on Barry Weiss's Substack, the University of Austin was a fixture of the weekly news cycle. A vast mix of more or less informed social media reactions, essays, and articles, both supportive and critical, followed the announcement. So I'd like to start by just clearing the air a bit. One goal of UATX is to grant a graduate degree in entrepreneurship and leadership. Every entrepreneurial endeavor seeks to fill a perceived unmet need in the marketplace. So what is the University of Austin, and what unmet need in the market of higher education do you believe it will serve?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I like the way you frame that because this is an entrepreneurial enterprise, and it's one of the reasons we're starting with that program. So you're right on target there. Let me begin from the perspective of principles.
Okay.
We believe very strongly that higher education has the responsibility to serve as, both the means through which society reflects upon its mores, its values, and the way it's governed, the way society is constituted. That the purpose of higher education is to provide society and individuals the means to think more clearly about important issues. In order to do that, we believe that universities have to be radically independent. And that if universities are not independent in a core sense, meaning that they lean too heavily in a political direction, or they're too excluding of multiple viewpoints, universities aren't serving their purpose. So what we're trying to do is start a university from the ground up that will be grounded in open inquiry and civil discourse as the guiding principles. That'll be a place where one's politics are practically irrelevant because we're focused on larger human questions. I think most universities have these ideals somewhere in their DNA. But universities are not acting upon those principles vigorously enough for the times in which we live.
Somewhat relatedly, in terms of the entrepreneurial opportunity, University of Austin boasts on its website about its novel financial model, with U.S. student loan debt at $1.7 trillion. New approaches to financing higher education are sorely needed today. What will be different about the costs and funding of UATX, and how does this financial model fit with that broader principles and mission that you just outlined?
Yeah. So I would say one of the problems with the financial model of higher education right now is that it's bound by what we call the iron triangle. And that is, the 3 points of the triangle for revenue are tuition, philanthropy, and then grants from various sources. That model cannot keep up with the rapidly increasing expense of delivering education. So the gap between the kind of revenues that universities can count on and what they actually need to run their operations is widening every year. Now, the top 20 or 30 universities are kind of in their own category. They have, endowments that make them, that kind of buffer them from financial concerns, although they still feel like they need to raise more and more money. But the other 4,000 universities out there are pretty much all on the brink of financial disaster. And we're seeing them start to drop. So, how do we solve for that? How do we create a financial model that is sustainable for institutions and accessible for students? The first piece of it is really simple. You have to cut costs. You have to deliver what you deliver more effectively and efficiently. Building an institution from the ground up allows you to do that. We've learned many things from the pandemic, and one of them is that you don't need lots and lots of administrators on site in person to run an organization. So we're going to cut down the number of administrators and probably outsource most administrative functions that aren't directly engaging with students. So doing that to help decrease cost and to give us some flexibility and allow the market to set the price for what we do. So that's part of it. The other part is to think about not just inputs, and that is the money that you collect from students and the money that you find to support their education, but to focus on outcomes as well. We can only lower the cost of providing higher education so far. Our target is to have our tuition set at exactly half the price of Harvard and show how we can deliver an education at that price point. Maybe it's not going to be Harvard. It might be an average of the top elite schools, but just as a kind of thumbnail target, half the price of Harvard will be our tuition. So that's still pretty expensive. That means we're still probably going to have to, charge $30,000 or so for tuition. It's only worth it to students and their families to take on that kind of financial burden if the university is invested in the outcomes. So what we're doing is we're aligning the outcomes with our financial model. We are going to be guaranteeing students either, and this is all in process right now. So I don't want to be held entirely accountable to this over time.
Sure.
Because we're working on the model, but we're going to try and guarantee them one of three outcomes. The first outcome would be the ability for all of our students to apply for seed money grants for their own entrepreneurial projects of up to $100,000. And the most promising projects will be funded by a fund that will raise through the university. So if you're going to spend $120,000 over 4 years on tuition and your university is willing to give you up to $100,000 to start your business or company at the end point, you can see how things line up there in terms of incentives. We also are already partnering with dozens and dozens of companies, corporations, organizations that will allow us to guarantee placement for our students when they graduate. So if you don't apply for an entrepreneurial grant, we are most likely going to be able to place you in a job that is in your field. And then the third guarantee we want to make, and again, I'm not promising this yet because it's something we're still working on, but I think we may be able to achieve this, is that if we don't place you in a job and we don't give you a grant, we're going to guarantee for 5 years your salary at the median point for your major after graduation. So if you become a teacher and the starting salary for teachers in let's say you're in Texas is $40,000, we're going to guarantee that over those first 5 years, you make $200,000. And if you don't, we're going to pay the difference.
Wow. Okay. So that actually helps transition to my next question. I want to push more, but we got limited time, so maybe I'll come back to things at the end if I have the time. One of the recurring criticisms of higher education today, as you already mentioned, is administrative bloat, which in turn has contributed to these inflated prices. Another common criticism, more from academics, is the siloing off of academic disciplines from one another. So there's nothing truly universal about universities anymore. They're not contributing to a common understanding of humanity's grasp of truth. Here at Acton, we're fans of the Dutch theologian and statesman Abraham Kuyper, who founded the Free University of Amsterdam to be independent of both church and state. However, he also founded it upon a Calvinist worldview and structured it based on the anthropology underlying that worldview in a way that lent coherence to the separate faculties and sciences. So how will the University of Austin be structured, both in terms of administration and faculties, and how does that reflect its broader worldview?
Well, we're not beginning with a Calvinist worldview. I hope that's not disappointing.
No, not my expectation.
But I would say we're beginning with an Aristotelian worldview. Our entire undergraduate curriculum is structured around Aristotle's taxonomies of knowledge. Right? Okay. And the idea is that we want to, as we try to create free and independent thinkers, people who have the critical capacities to be prudent in life, make the right decisions, identify what's desirable and better. We're going to employ a curriculum, and it's going to be a common curriculum for all undergraduates. It's going to move through, beginning with speculative philosophy, through natural philosophy to practical philosophy. So we're building a core curriculum of courses across the first 2 years that begins with epistemology, then moves to metaphysics, then moves to astronomy, geography, moves on to biology, and beyond that into ethics and politics and that. This entire curriculum will be undertaken by all of our students, and it'll be taught by all of our faculty. So to go to your point about a kind of genuine culture, a common culture, our faculty, no matter what their, let's say, disciplinary background is, they're all going to be teaching in the Common Core, which will be essentially a great book's Common Core around these themes. And we're doing that because we think that faculty should model the same intellectual journey that our students are on, which means going beyond what your particular area of interest and expertise is, and looking broadly at as many areas of human knowledge as we can encompass.
So they all kind of need to be generalists in that sense.
We want them to be generalists and also to have their own specialties. So after the first 2 years, rather than having majors, we're forming what we're calling centers of inquiry, centers of intellectual inquiry that'll be thematic, kind of like think tanks or institutes. And there'll be centers around education, around politics, around technology and engineering. So we want our scholars to be able to contribute very specifically through their fields in those academic centers, but then also teach generally in the core.
Okay, so relatedly, and maybe you can correct me if I'm mistaken here. I know next summer in 2022, you plan to launch a summer program taught, as far as I understand, by your 3 founding faculty fellows. Is that correct? Doctors Peter Bogosian, Ayan Hirsi Ali, and Kathleen Stock.
Yeah, we just added a 4th, Rob Henderson.
Oh, okay.
Who's doing great work on he's writing this book on luxury beliefs and that. He's at Cambridge. So Rob's just joined us as a 4th fellow this very week.
I have this question more relates to the other 3 then, and it's interesting to know that we have a 4th already. Coming from a religious background, I remember long before there was such a thing as wokeness, which has been all the buzz today, and a lot of the press, even about University of Austin, has been about it not being captive to wokeness, cancel culture, woke narratives, that sort of thing. But I remember 2 decades ago when I first entered college, that deeply religious, usually conservative parents and students were commonly skeptical of state universities precisely because they didn't want their deeply held values to be the object of attack and mockery by tenured professors. This trope was as recently portrayed as in the 2014 film God's Not Dead, which I do not personally recommend, but it serves to illustrate my point that this is still kind of in a certain demographic. It's still part of their mindset. Now, Dr. Bogosian is author of a book titled A Manual for Creating Atheists. Professor Ali is known for her criticism of fundamentalist Islam, but also for being famously atheist herself. And Professor Stock, despite coming under heavy criticism for her comments on transgender identity, is a feminist scholar. Has been described by the Times as a, quote, left-wing lesbian. Now, I know as an academic that people, every professor has to teach things they don't necessarily believe themselves, and good professors can do that. But I would expect that religious conservatives would be a natural demographic group looking for the sort of school that the University of Austin aspires to be. So what would you tell interested parents and students who look at this faculty list and might see very little apparent common ground with their own values and worldview?
Well, I would say that the initial founding faculty fellows we have were not selected because of their political views or even their worldviews. They were selected because these are people who've shown great courage in times of where institutions are trying to suppress ideas. So they are in many ways are kind of they're sort of heroic figures, and so we wanted to bring them on to kind of embody the spirit of the institution. And I would just say they don't represent in any purposeful way, let's say, the overall choices that we're going to make about faculty. We're going to have faculty across the entire political spectrum, across the spectrum of beliefs. We believe that mixing people together in a university setting who come from diverging backgrounds, diverging belief systems is a critical component of education. I mean, we just believe that wholeheartedly. I will say the one thing that I think universities has lost that we're trying to replace or try to replenish is being alive to the possibility of the transcendent. And I think this is what, this is the common point of contact that our faculty and our staff and students will have, that, we are all trying to aim for something higher. And in some cases, that'll be a sort of the rational pursuit of truth. In other cases, that'll be the pursuit of other things, metaphysical and otherwise. But we believe that higher education needs to attend to the higher things in life. And so that's the common ground, I think we'll see. That somebody like Peter Bogosian, who is a very dear friend of mine, we disagree on practically everything when it comes to beliefs, personal beliefs. People ask me my politics. I'm like, they're really simple. I believe in God and I like old books. I mean, that's as complicated as I am.
Yeah.
But Peter and I both agree that like getting into the scrum of conversation and dialogue and throwing ideas around and together in a format where you have mutual trust and you do so in a kind of dignified way. That's what the life of the mind should be about. So that's what we stand for. Since
you mentioned Robert Henderson, could you tell me just a little bit about him and his work and his research as well?
Yeah, he's at Cambridge University right now, finishing up his PhD. But he's been, already a very important cultural commentator, and his work has the most. I think the part of his work that's had the most impact is defining the category of luxury beliefs. So Rob came from a very challenged background. He grew up in the foster care system. He grew up very poor. He moved from house to house. He describes living out of garbage bags because he had to take his stuff with him so many times.
Yeah.
And then, he's a young man who's gone on to become a PhD student at Cambridge. And he's particularly sensitive to what he sees as the elite class's imposition of beliefs upon society that negatively impact people in, let's say, lower socioeconomic strata or otherwise, and where the elites are insulated from the consequences of their beliefs. So. He's a real trenchant social critic, very remarkable young man. we're thrilled to have them on board.
Excellent. Thank you. In your announcement on November 8th, you stated, it is not just that we are failing students as individuals, we are failing the nation. You've touched on this a little bit, but I'd like to hear more about what civic value does, or at least should, higher education add to a liberal democracy like the United States? And how do you see the University of Austin as filling that role?
Well, I mean, look, I think it's beyond obvious now that the major social crisis we're facing is one of polarization, tribalism, of people turning away from each other and against one another. And I think universities have a responsibility to help us change course. All right, to help bring people together in conversation and dialogue, to help us develop the tools to be critical of our own beliefs, so that we can the beliefs that we hold responsibly. I don't know what other institution we can turn to in society today that can move us back towards a position of tolerance, a position of empathy and understanding. I think universities have a tremendous responsibility to shape young people in ways that will move us back towards one another rather than turning away from one another.
If I may end on a provocative note, in the 1997 film Good Will Hunting, one of my favorites, Matt Damon's title character has a confrontation with a Harvard grad student at a bar, in which he tells his opponent, "You dropped $150,000 on education that you could have gotten for $1.50 in late charges at the public library." Up to this point, I've been purposefully challenging you to make your best case for the University of Austin. But how would you answer those who think the solution to the problem of higher education today is not a university at all, but some other entrepreneurial model, whether trade schools, research institutes, decentralized online courses and forums, or I suppose a public library card in the case of Good Will Hunting? Why should parents and students choose a university in general? And how will the University of Austin in particular contribute to the value of universities as a whole?
Look, I think it's perfectly reasonable for people to search for alternatives outside of the system that we have of higher education. And I think for some people that is that's a much better path for them to take. However, higher education is the endpoint of a process of maturation and development that begins, practically in the cradle. And in many ways, the reason that we have higher education is to allow students who have mastered skills come to understand the world in terms of sciences, humanities, et cetera, through their K through 12 education. The purpose of higher education is to turn a critical eye back upon everything that they've learned up to that point, so they can be fully developed adult human beings. For that to be achieved, the best way we can achieve that is through a community of fellow travelers and seekers, some of whom we call scholars, some of whom we call students. That these individuals, in searching for truth together, help each of us kind of sharpen our own skills individually. So there's always going to be need for higher education, but if people can explore alternatives and find other ways to be flourishing in their life, I encourage them to do that. I mean, I think that's important.
I'm curious to find out. So the University of Austin, you are choosing to go the brick and mortar model, in line with what you just said. But why Austin? Of all locations in the country, even of all locations in Texas, why Austin and not somewhere else? What is it about Austin that seems to be the right place for the University of Austin?
Austin right now is simply the most exciting, innovative, entrepreneurial place in the country, if not the world. Austin, I call Austin sort of one great big maker space right now. People are pouring into Austin to start businesses, to embark on exciting technological ventures, to reshape K through 12 education. Austin is so filled right now with innovators and creative people. And that's the spirit that we're trying to tap into. I also think the dynamics of Austin in some ways mirror the dynamics that we want to have on our campus. Austin is a, very liberal, progressive city in a conservative state. And because of that, because it's sort of a blue city and a red state, if you will, people in Austin are constantly encountering people that they that don't share their worldviews in both directions. And it really creates a very tolerant and open environment. And we want to embed that kind of tolerance, that kind of, that sense that, encountering difference is an everyday thing, a normal part of life. Want to embed that in the institution. So I think it's a good fit for us on that front as well.
I also wanted to ask, so you were formerly at St. John's. It's not your first rodeo in terms of heading up a university or a college. How does your past experience relate to what you're doing now and hoping to do with the University of Austin?
St. John's is one of the most exceptional institutions in the world. I mean, it's just a wonderful place. If your listeners aren't aware, it's a great books college. Students essentially follow a single curriculum, read about 200 great books over 4 years. It's a place where you still have broad, representation across every category, political, faith, and otherwise. And it's a place where civil discourse is still the order of the day. So carrying all that from what's essentially a small great books college into a major comprehensive university is what we're trying to do. Trying to carry that spirit of civil discourse, productive dialogue, and a de-emphasizing of our concerns of the moment in favor of looking at the broadest possible scope of human experience and achievement. That's all coming from St. John's into this institution.
So you mentioned with finances, with your principles in general, you want to be pretty fiercely independent, in which case I presume you're not taking any federal loans, money, that sort of thing. Correct me if I'm wrong in there, or state even. But then what options would there be for talented but lower income prospective students? Do you have a program set up in terms of scholarships, grants, that financial aid of your own? Is that built into the model at this point?
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. Look, I was a first generation college student. I was the recipient of scholarships that allowed me to go to college. We are 100% committed to making this education accessible to all students who want to seek it. So we don't want financial barriers to get in their way. So we're creating our own system of scholarships and aid and loans and that will enable us to offer that to students.
All right, then how about we'll just end with a last word. What would be your parting pitch for the University of Austin for any listeners?
I would say what we're hoping to achieve with this new institution is to renew in higher education the commitment to ideas over ideology. That we think that university should be the home of ideas, that people should live in universities with strong convictions, lightly held, that civil discourse is the key component of a learning community, and that civil discourse itself has three key components. One is intellectual humility. Two is the acknowledgement and acceptance of the value and dignity of every human being. And three is a passion for truth. So if we can put those three things together and build an institution on those premises, we think we'll be offering something of value to the world.
Dr. Kanelos, thank you so much for joining us at Act in Line.
Oh, my pleasure.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you'd like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Gabriel Jaja.